next judge that we are going to cover in this series is the next major judge in Israel is Deborah. And I have to say that this is probably my favorite of the judges. Deborah, so often we look at Deborah, and I've heard it said many times that Deborah was chosen by God to be the judge because there was such a shortage of godly men during this time in Israel's history. And there may be a little bit of truth to that, but I also find that statement just a little bit disturbing because it makes us feel as though God will only choose the best. God will only choose the most prominent. And that's definitely not the case, as we'll see throughout Judges, and we also see throughout the whole Bible. But God will choose who he will, and for this time, it was Deborah that needed to be used. We find in Judges chapter 4, verse 1, then the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, and the commander of his army was Sisera. Now, it's very interesting. We often find the commander of the armies in the Old Testament. We hear of Joab, the king of David's army. We hear of Abner, the commander of Saul's army. And during that time era, the commanders of the army were very influential, and we'll find that Sisera was actually the one that the story in Judges with Deborah focuses on. Of course, we see in verse 3, the sons of Israel cried to the Lord, for he had 900 chariots, and he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. So the Israelites were under this oppression from the king for 20 years, and they finally realized what they had done wrong. They had fallen into idolatry. Again, they repented, they truly repented, and God did send a deliverer, and we will find this in Deborah. Now, Deborah, the prophetess, was judging Israel at the time. In verse 5, we see she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. So she was the one that the sons of Israel would come to, and she would decide what was right and what was wrong, and what was happening there, and give them instruction from God. She heard the voice of God as a prophetess. Now, it says in verse 6, now she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun. I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, and his chariots and his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give him into your hand. Now that's a pretty big promise that Deborah is making. She's saying to Barak, if you will simply be faithful and go, I will draw Sisera out to you. All you have to do is kill him. Everything will be there, and God will give you the victory. But notice what Barak's response is. In verse 8, then Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go with you. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. You know, there's a verse in the book of Isaiah where God is asking to send someone, and Isaiah's words were, here I am, Lord, send me. Well, this is totally the opposite of what Barak said. Barak instead said, well, if you'll go with me, I will go. I think that's important, and we'll see later, you know, sometimes God does ask us to go no matter what, and sometimes he may provide someone to go with us, but at other times we do have to be the one who says, here I am, send me. She, Deborah, said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. So she did go with him just as he asked, but because he was not faithful in following what God truly wanted him to do, the victory was going to go to a woman. It's very interesting how this story unfolds. Now, verse 12 we find, then they told Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone to Mount Tabor. Sisera called together all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the people who were with him, from Harosheth to the river Kishon. Now, again, we see that just as Deborah had said, he did bring out all of his troops and all of his chariots and all of his soldiers. And again, God would have given the victory to Barak had he been willing to follow what God had commanded. Deborah said to Barak, arise, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Behold, the Lord has gone out before you. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. The Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak, and Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. Now just imagine if Barak had obeyed God, that last part would not have been here. That part, and Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But because Barak had chosen not to go with what God had told him to do, the victory did have to go to someone else. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth-Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword, not even one was left. Now Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. Now notice that there was peace between Jael's husband and the king. There was peace between Sisera and the husband of Jael. Jael also, like Barak, is going to have to take a side, but we will find where Barak was unfaithful, Jael was faithful. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my master, turn aside to me, do not be afraid." And he turned aside into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. We find Jael's a little bit like Esther. Esther went to her husband, the most powerful man, and she invited him to dinner before she gave him her request. This is a lot like what Jael did. She invited Sisera into her tent, and she never really promised peace, but she invited, and he kind of read between the lines with the rest. He said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a bottle of milk and gave him a drink. Then she covered him. He said to her, "Stand in the doorway of the tent, and it shall be if anyone comes and inquires of you and says, 'Is there anyone here?' that you shall say no." Now, Jael again had the same decision that Barak had, but we're going to see faithfulness on the part of Jael. But Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and seized a hammer in her hand and went secretly to him and drove the peg into his temple. And it went through the ground, for he was sound asleep and exhausted, so he died. So Jael took a tent peg while Sisera was laying on the ground on his side. She took a tent peg and drove it through his head, through his temples, and nailed him to the ground. We find in verse 23, "So God subdued on that day Jabin the king of Canaan before the sons of Israel. The hand of the sons of Israel pressed heavier and heavier upon Jabin the king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin the king of Canaan." So we find that because of Jael's faithfulness, the oppression had ended. God had delivered them from the oppression. Now, something that I find very interesting, and where I want to tie this into our study on spiritual warfare, is in 2 Corinthians 10. And 2 Corinthians 10 verses 4 and 5 tells us something very interesting. "For the weapons of our warfare are not physical, weapons of flesh and blood, but they are mighty before God for the overthrow and destruction of strongholds." Now that is from the Amplified Bible, and when we think back to Jael, we can think of the weapons that she used. She did not use a typical weapon. She used a tent peg and she used a hammer. And that is how she led the Israelites out of their oppression. This next verse is very interesting, and we're going to go back again to the attitude of Barak and the attitude of Jael when I read these verses from the Amplified Bible. "Inasmuch as we refute arguments and theories and reasonings and every proud and lofty thing that sets itself up against the true knowledge of God, and we leave every thought and purpose away captive into the obedience of Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One." Now think back to the thoughts of Barak. What was he thinking when Deborah asked him to have victory over Sisera? He could not refute the argument of how powerful Sisera was. He only thought, "If you go with me, then I will go." Now contrast that with the argument of Jael. Now Jael had a little bit more to lose because there was peace between her husband and the enemy. But she refuted the argument. She fought the argument that came against her, the reasonings that came against her. And she took that weapon and she brought the Israelites out of the oppression that they were under, out of the persecution. Again, that is what Paul is telling us in 1 Corinthians 10 verse 5. We have to refute those arguments with weapons. Last week we discussed the first weapon. We discussed the sword of the Spirit. We discussed Ehud's sword, the double-edged sword, the Word of God. And we're going to get a little bit into next week when we study again about Deborah. We're going to get into the praise that Deborah and Barak gave. And we're going to study that in detail as we study more about spiritual warfare from the book of Judges.